The woes faced by sponsored spouses coming to Canada. Indian leaders pay homage to Satya Sai Baba. And rage over corruption allegations against the former Commonwealth Games chief. Hello and welcome to Omni News South Asian Edition. I'm Angie Sapp. A host of Toronto refugee and immigrants rights groups, legal clinics and women's organizations are calling on the federal parties to reject a proposed change to Canada's immigration law. Now, the change is regarding a 2-year mandatory time for sponsored spouses, and today was the final day for online consultations on this bill. As Kush Panthaki reports, these groups say Citizenship and Immigration Canada's so-called conditional permanent residence visa will only make women more vulnerable to violence and abuse.
The so-called conditional permanent residence requirement would see sponsored spouses who have been in a relationship of 2 years or less stay within that relationship for a minimum of 2 more years before they're fully granted their permanent residence. And Kareen Baki of the South Asian Legal Clinic says that leaves sponsored spouses, who by and large are women, open to abuse.
People are primarily fearful of the impacts on women, especially on sponsored women, that might unfortunately sometimes do find themselves in abusive relationships. So adding this extra component, this conditional permanent residence component, puts especially women in abusive situations at further risk, and kind of makes them, I guess, more like hostage to these partners because they can't leave the relationship without fear of being potentially deported.
And it's that fear of being deported that Baki says prevents women in abusive situations from coming forward to report the abuse in the first place. To make matters worse, she says, any resources that immigrant women might have gone to help them get out of abusive relationships have been cut by the very federal government that is requiring them to stay within those relationships. Ostensibly, the federal government says the visa proposal is a further measure in its attempt to crack down on fraudulent marriages for the purposes of immigration. But immigration lawyer Max Chaudhary says the new requirement will only lead to more fraud.
I don't see the I don't see the advantage necessarily in imposing this new proposed rule, because I think if parties are both willing to take part in this, they'll simply extend their so-called relationship for 2 years until they pass the removal of the terms and conditions.
Chaudhary says the online consultations into this proposed rule stemmed from town hall meetings the government held in Brampton and Mississauga. However, many immigrant groups say most of their clients weren't even aware that there was a consultative process available because it was only announced in the Canada Gazette, which is the Government of Canada's official newspaper. Now, while online, it isn't a resource that's uppermost in the minds of most people, let alone those of sponsored spouses. Meanwhile, the federal government is somewhat vague in the steps it will take to address the issue of marriage fraud. In an email to Omni News, Citizenship and Immigration Canada says simply that it is considering regulatory changes to crack down on marriage fraud and deter people from using relationships of convenience to circumvent Canada's immigration laws. Meanwhile, the feds are also proposing a process to allow bona fide spouses and partners in abusive situations to come forward without facing enforcement action. This is Kush Panthaki reporting for Omni News.